Cocktails with Camilla, Nige, and a revolving bunch of deadbeats and hangabouts. Brought to you by Thompson Whiskey New Zealand, the premium stuff.
Welcome back to The Wire. You're on 95 BFM. It's just gone 20 past the hour. I'm Simon Maude, your host, until 1 o'clock today. Now, still waiting for some feedback on the drink-drive limit lowering story. Be really keen to hear about this. Just, how far have attitudes shifted, or people still hit real hidden boozers? Anyway, I've got Selwyn Manning on the line, so it's time for this.
Oh, here he comes! Hey. Minister!
How are you? Minister, answer. Well, how's your wife?
Answer the question, Minister!
Counterclockwise with Selwyn Manning from livenews.co.nz.
Selwyn, it's another week in New Zealand politics. As our listeners might know, the SAS is heading back to Afghanistan, but for what? Selwyn, you've picked up on a few things about what John Key is and isn't letting on about.
That's right, Simon. There's some anomalies that are starting to surface here. Now, first off, in the background to this, there's significant controversy over whether a small small New Zealand SAS unit of 4 to 6 soldiers recently deployed to Afghanistan by the New Zealand government is actually going to be taking part in a combat role, or as the Americans call them, a kill squad. Now, the government's official line is that the small unit of 4 to 6 soldiers is to plan and provide logistics for an operation to identify and locate insurgents responsible for the killings of the New Zealand soldiers in the Bamiyan province. But yesterday, the Prime Minister, John Key, he refuted a report by New Zealand investigative journalist John Stevenson, who reported to Radio New Zealand, and I'll quote here, "I've been told that the mission of the troops is not to gather intelligence, but to help out the strikes or the raids on those insurgents that killed the PRT soldiers in August," end of quote. Now, that was John Stevenson citing information that had been provided to him by two distinctly different courts of contacts that he has, one up in Afghanistan and sources down here in New Zealand, unrelated sources saying the same thing. But the Prime Minister, Simon, John Key, he yesterday said on 3 News' Frontline program with Rachel Smalley, and I'll quote here, "It is in the margins of a small group and they are there to provide logistics and planning." Now, John Key refuted John Stevenson's claim that they had a combat and basically a guns and shooting role in this. And John Key said, for example, and here's a quote where anomalies start to surface. And John Key said, in a direct quote here, "But they are not the SAS in the way that when I was Prime Minister said they were going to Afghanistan. That is a very different deal, and that was large numbers and in a pretty active front-line role," end of quote. Now, that statement by the Prime Minister saying that the SAS that were up there when the SAS soldiers in Kabul were killed in 2011 were in a pretty active frontline role, as the Prime Minister says now, that is something that he completely was denying at this time last year. And I'll just go on to that part here where that statement that John Key just made yesterday is in direct conflict to the statements that he said back on late September 2011 when the 3 News reporter Rebecca Wright asked John Key directly, "Do you see it," meaning the SAS, "as in a combat role with the SAS in Kabul?" And the Prime Minister said then, "No, look, it's a mentoring role. I have taken the liberty of checking that at length with the head of the SAS, and it is a mentoring role," end of quote.
Now, off air, we actually discussed this a little bit about the motivations for sending the SAS there in the first place, and I have this theory that basically that there's some upward pressure coming from the actual defence forces on the government. They want soldiers on the ground. Their soldiers want basically experience. They've trained to be soldiers. This is what they do. How likely is it that the Defence Force has actually pushed for this deployment in whatever shape or form it takes?
Look, what we do know about this, Simon, is yes, the Defence Force, New Zealand Defence Force, requested that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet approve the deployment of a small unit of SAS up there this year to gather intelligence and to do logistical planning up around the Bamiyan province relating to trying to identify those insurgents, the Taliban, that were responsible for killing our ordinary soldiers that were in the Bamiyan province on patrol earlier this year. Now, we know that part is fact, and we know that that's what the Prime Minister and the Defence Force are sticking to. They're saying they're up there in that role. New Zealand's SAS involvement in Afghanistan, we've got to remember, thanks to Nikki Hager's work and also work of John Stevenson, has been going on since late 2001. So the Labour-led government was deploying SAS troops there in secret right through its term, and the national government admitted to it basically when it came in and redeployed up to 70 personnel, SAS personnel per unit deployment at its peak. But what we're seeing here is the Prime Minister, during that time when he admitted our SAS were up there, he insisted that they were in a mentoring role, not in a combat role and not in front-line role. For example, Rebecca Wright asked him specifically in late September last year after 2 SAS were killed in Kabul, and she asked, why is it an issue to say the SAS are in the front line or in a combat role? Now, John Key replied, and I quote here, "It wouldn't be, but they are not. I mean, the simple facts of life are New Zealanders are incredibly proud of them, but we sent them in this particular occasion to Afghanistan to be in a mentoring role," end of quote. Oh, and he goes on, just say he's put it in context, and quote again, John Key, "It is a great tragedy. We have lost 2 of our SAS people, and everyone feels that pain, no one more than me. But I am not going to say they are doing something that they are not. They are in a role where they are mentoring the CRU, which is Combat Response Unit of Afghanistan," now end of quote. So he is saying that they're not in a frontline combat role. Yesterday, he said, and I'll say it again, what the Prime Minister said here was that they were. He says that statement raises a number, basically this is what I'm trying to point out here, that the Prime Minister's statement yesterday raises these questions because he said that they were in a frontline role last year. And that is something that for people who are following this issue, John Stevenson is primarily among those, that this kind of anomaly and inconsistency by the Prime Minister, particularly on the most serious issues relating to what involvement we are doing at a particular time, and also for the privilege of the public record on this and the historical record, the Prime Minister is not saying the same thing that he was actually pushed on this time last year.
Do you think if the Prime Minister all of a sudden just decided, you know what, the SAS, they're over there, they're in harm's way, they'll probably see combat, do you think the New Zealand public would be all right with that?
Well, he was asked that last year. One of the questions that Rebecca Wright put to him last year at a press conference immediately after the second killing of an SAS soldier in Kabul, and said, while basically paraphrasing, why is it precious for us to admit that they're in a combat or frontline role? Now, John Key said, well, no, but they are not in a frontline role, they're in a mentoring role. Now, again, yesterday, he said, that back then, reference to back then, he said that was large numbers and in a pretty active frontline role. It's a complete contradiction to what he was insisting was the case last year. Now, I guess the Prime Minister's got to explain himself on this type of thing. We can only guess. He appears to be attempting to really sow the record straight, and got to respect the privilege of the office of Prime Minister, that he's trying to actually ensure that the facts as he knows them are actually being put out there when he's asked on them. He'd hardly want to actually lie his way through things. I'm not suggesting that. But is he so far down the information pecking order that he has been given information that he believes in good faith is this, and later finds that it's quite different? Now, this frontline thing, it is very, very important on these issues for many reasons, but one from the point of view that the Cabinet deploys these soldiers to a combat region for a particular role. Back last year, he said the Cabinet signed them off to conduct a mentoring role for Afghani security forces in Kabul. This year, he says they were deployed in a frontline capacity. Now, what's the truth on that? What are the facts? We do not know.
All right. Well, maybe he'll in the next few days he'll clarify his statements for us. Although it does seem that, like you mentioned before, that where the Prime Minister is in terms of the pecking order of information here, that maybe that's something politicians find quite convenient in terms of, I guess the term is plausible deniability. They don't want to know too much, otherwise when awkward questions are asked, they actually give the wrong answer.
Yes, and one can respect that operationally it's the job of the New Zealand Defence Forces to work within the situation or the theatre that they're deployed to. But it's the Prime Minister and his Cabinet that authorise the perimeters of their engagement up there. And the Prime Minister was saying last year that they were there to carry out a mentor role, that yes, they would get in the course of that mentoring role into combat, and that's how the people were killed, but they're not leading those units. But this year, he is saying that relating to that deployment back last year, that they're in a frontline role. It's quite different, and one would expect that the Cabinet would be asking questions on this as much as journalists would be. One would hope so, anyway. Yeah.
Well, we'll see how that goes. Of course, I think everyone's going to be focused on the US presidential elections next week. But it's it's good that we have journalists like you shining the light on the often unvisited stories.
Well, it's mostly journalists like John Stevenson that are actually up there in the firing line in a dangerous situation and are bringing this information back where we can actually then put it to our Prime Minister and our politicians. But thanks again, Simon, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, good night. See you.
Right.
It's just gone past 12:30 on 95 BFM. Of course, that was Mr. Selwyn Manning from livenews.co.nz. Now, of course, we were just talking about the continued involvement of New Zealand's SAS in Afghanistan.